The Canadian government's new emissions reductions plan for 2030 says that farmers are key to achieving net zero by 2050, and it sets out a number of policies designed to reduce greenhouse gases in the agricultural sector. So I'm going to talk to Darrin Qualman, who's Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action for the National Farmers Union. Welcome to the interview, Darrin.
Thanks very much. Look forward to it.
Well, look, farming is 10% of Canada's greenhouse gases, about 690 megatons per year, comes from crop production, comes from animal production. And the government's got a number of policies and investment funds that it announced with the emissions reduction plan. Give me kind of your overview of federal policies in this area.
Well, I think it's good, a lot of good news and some other things people have to work on. We've seen over the last year and a half a real acceleration and increase in ambition, and the federal government's rolling out a lot of new programs, and most interesting is the OnFarm Climate Action Fund as part of the Ag Climate Solution. So a real move to trying to do something on this file.
Well, what about that fund? It's $470 million, and it's to help farmers adopt sustainable practices such as cover crops, rotational grazing, and fertilizer management, according to the announcement. What are there any issues with that? Or where are we at with those practices?
Yeah, really key. It addresses some of the really big sources of emissions in agriculture. Nitrogen fertilizer is probably the biggest, and most importantly, it's the one that's growing every year. So if we want to bend that curve down, flatten it, and inflect it downward, it's nitrogen where we have to focus. And the OnFarm Climate Action Fund does that. It has a lot of funding for nitrogen management. It also has funding for rotational grazing. So when farmers manage their grazing land more intensively, move their animals more often, that grass can grow back, it's grazed more efficiently, it's more productive, can lower the emissions from the animals, and it can sequester some carbon. And then the third aspect of the OnFarm Climate Action Fund is cover crops, keeping that soil covered, a living root in the soil, puts carbon into the soil, prevents erosion, and it also helps capture some of that nitrogen as nitrous oxide that otherwise might escape from that field. It's captured in those cover crops. So three aspects of that really key to changing the on-farm practices to lower emissions.
What about the nitrogen industry, Darrin? It uses a lot of natural gas to make fertilizer. And is that covered in this?
It's not, and you're right. Nitrogen fertilizer really is a fossil fuel product. The main feedstock, the main cost is the natural gas. And that gas is split, the hydrogen is taken, and a lot of the carbon is vented as carbon dioxide. And the government has specifically said that the nitrogen fertilizer industry is not part of their target to reduce emissions from nitrogen fertilizer use by 30%. That's a great target. The government's very ambitious and real leadership setting that target, but they've excluded nitrogen production. We're going to assume that they're going to circle back to that and come up with programs with nitrogen producers to reduce those emissions, which are quite significant, several million tons per year.
Okay. What about the $330 million for the Agricultural Clean Technology Program? And this one area that interests me, because I have a family that still farms, and I've interviewed a couple of electric vehicle technology companies, such as Monarch Tractor in California, make an electric tractor, and it's autonomous. It can be driverless. And I wondered to what extent those kinds of technologies are part of this funding and part of, the strategy for Canadian farmers to lower their GHGs.
The issue around agricultural technology is probably the most interesting, also the most perilous and risky, and the least understood. So on the one hand, you're right, diesel fuel use, fossil fuel use in agriculture is a significant source, not a huge source of emissions. Nitrogen fertilizer and manure and others are larger, but it's still significant. So we need to cut fossil fuel use, and maybe things like battery electric, medium size and small tractors are part of that. But we're also seeing a lot of very pernicious and damaging technologies being foisted into the sector. Artificial intelligence, autonomous machinery, robots, and it could lead to what we're referring to as driverless tractors and farmerless fields. You know, the expulsion of farmers, farm families from the sector, and the replacement with tech platforms, big data, AI, this sort of thing. And that's bad in itself, in that it takes control and profit and gives it over to these tech companies. But it also then also paves the way for the consolidation of land ownership and very, very large production units, and threatens, you know, the century-long tradition or more of family farms. So there might be a bit, well, there's a lot to be very concerned about in these announcements around tech.
And I can appreciate this. I did my master's thesis 35 years ago on the rise of power farming in Saskatchewan prior to 1930. And even in the 1920s, farmers were debating this issue. As soon as you replace a tractor with a horse, now you need twice as much land to farm, and you're displacing a family.
Yeah, I think you mean replace a horse with a tractor. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry, that's what I meant. Replace a horse with a tractor. So, but I guess that process played out over 100 years to get us where we are today. Is it possible to stop that process?
I think it really is. I think, for instance, if you're the government of Canada and you look at farms getting very, very large and land getting increasingly concentrated, your first instinct might not be to say woe to technology, but it probably should be to look at the technology and say, let's not invest taxpayers' money in 100 million and larger increments into technologies that might accelerate or feed into that giantism and that destruction of farms and the concentration of land ownership.
Gotcha. So it's not a question of stopping the process so much as let's not subsidize it.
Yeah, I farmed for years. I used a lot of technology. I still work with farmers every day that use, you know, lots and lots of technology. But there's a difference between technology that farmers deploy and then technology that's designed to replace farmers.
Gotcha. And what about the 100 million in transformative science for a sustainable sector? What are we talking about when we say sustainable science?
I think a lot of research needs to be done. I'll give you an example of some of that science. Right now, the National Inventory Report reports greenhouse gas emissions in a certain way. So for instance, fertilizer is reported essentially based on how much fertilizer used. So if farmers use the fertilizer better, they put it on in the spring rather than the fall, they place it better, they use enhanced coatings on the fertilizer, they take a lot of steps to reduce emissions. A lot of that currently isn't captured in the National Inventory Report. And one of the reasons is there isn't enough peer-reviewed journal science to say that if you do X, the emission reduction will be Y, and we have a high degree of certainty. So that is one example of the kind of science we could use. Another quick example is just around adaptation. As we see on the prairies, we're going to see about double the rate of planetary average warming. So if the planet warms by 2 or 3 degrees, we'll warm by 4, 5, 6 degrees. There's a lot of science needed to help farmers understand how they can continue to be successful in those rapidly changing climates.
The last question, Darrin. You belong to the Farmers for Climate Solutions, and how will Farmers for Climate Solutions be responding to this to the emissions reduction plan?
Yeah, the National Farmers Union, for whom I work, is a founding member of the coalition of 24 groups, Farmers for Climate Solutions. And National Farmers Union and Farmers for Climate Solutions are working on a number of fronts. One, we're doing a very large task force to create a real detailed plan for emissions reduction that we're going to feed in to the 5-year ag policy framework. And we're also looking very carefully and critically at the emission reduction plan. One question we have is, why does it include just a 1% reduction in emissions from agriculture between 2005 and 2030. We know that the government has a target for 30% reduction in fertilizer. We see large potential for manure and other aspects. We think that that reduction can be much, much larger, probably 20% by 2030. Yet in the report, there's just 1%. So that's just one example of the many questions we have and the many ways in which we want to work with the government. As farmers, we want to work with the government to let them know we want to do more. We want to do our share to get to those Canadian targets.
Great, Darrin. Thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Markham.